Vamos entonces al plenario 2, protección de datos y gobierno electrónico. En épocas de nueva gestión pública basada en tecnologías de la información, las administraciones estatales continúan siendo grandes recopiladoras de datos personales, recogiéndolos y tratándolos al servicio de sus propios cometidos. Acceso a la información pública, intercambios y reutilización de la información que dispone un determinado sector de la Administración. Datos abiertos, transparencia del mercado financiero, inspecciones del fisco, son algunos de los escenarios e instrumentos que plantean tensiones, abriendo así interrogantes sobre cuándo y cómo legitimar una colecta inicial, pero también una cesión o comunicación posteriores de datos personales en contextos de administración electrónica. Las autoridades deben encontrar entonces las fórmulas racionales y legitimantes en cada caso, evitando que un avance pujante del gobierno electrónico se deslice en forma casi inadvertida e incluso pretendidamente justificada hacia el concomitante descuido o incluso el liso avasallamiento del edificio jurídico construido alrededor de la protección de datos personales. Estas son un poco las premisas del plenario. Para abordar la temática, invito al señor Trevor Hughes, es el presidente y CEO de la International Association of Privacy Professionals, la más amplia asociación sobre la temática, quien será el moderador, junto a los señores Pierre Trudel, de la Universidad de Montreal, y el señor Wagner Diniz, gerente general de la W3C. Muchas gracias.
Señores y señoras, estimados compañeros y compañeras, buenas tardes. Soy muy feliz de estar aquí con ustedes hoy. In English, we have a saying, a tempest in a teacup. It is meant to signify a big debate over a small issue or an unimportant issue. Well, today outside the hotel, we certainly have our tempest, but this is no teacup that we are about to discuss. It's an enormous issue that highlights the dynamic and complicated tensions that exist in the field of data protection. My name is Trevor Hughes, and I am the President and CEO of the International Association of Privacy Professionals, the IAPP. The IAPP is a non-advocacy, not-for-profit organization that represents the burgeoning profession of privacy. We provide education, network, and certification to nearly 12,000 privacy professionals in over 70 countries around the world. I'm very happy to be joined today in our panel on this topic by a fellow Canadian, Professor Pierre Trudel from the University of Montreal, and Wagner Diniz, who is the manager of the W3C in Brazil. And as we begin, let me mention that the IAPP is not an advocacy organization. We try to provide a forum in which debates may occur over the field of privacy. And as a result, anything that I say that sounds like an opinion is my own and not necessarily that of the IAPP. But as a moderator, I have the good fortune of asking more questions than I'll answer. The topic of this panel is data protection and e-government. It's a broad and important topic, to be sure. The power of e-government seems clear. More efficient delivery of services and greater levels of support for citizens than in any time in human history. In many ways, the idea of e-government is an extension of Moore's Law, of Creeder's Law, of Metcalfe's Law. As computing and storage get cheaper and smaller and faster, we can extract more and more value from data. But the story of e-government may be even simpler than this. Governments need to serve citizens in modalities and manners that are meaningful to their citizens. And today's citizens are deeply, passionately engaged in the web, in mobile, and emerging technologies. Thus, governments have but little choice and must engage services where their citizens are found. Now, e-government has enormous power and can bring enormous and beneficial changes. I had the good fortune of recently visiting Delhi, India, and learned of or saw a project in action that I'd like to share with you to just demonstrate the power of e-government initiatives. This is the Universal ID project in India. India, as you may know, is an enormous developing country. very sophisticated economy, yet a developing economy. It has 1.2 billion citizens, and the majority of those citizens are born with no official documentation. No birth certificate, no identification, no piece of paper that tells them who they are to authenticate their identity. In fact, the reason they know their name is because their mother and father say it so frequently. Now, there are huge infrastructure barriers that are created with regards to domestic growth as a result of the limited ability to authenticate Indian citizens. Bank accounts, mail service, social services, health records, access to social services so desperately needed in that developing country are all greatly limited. In fact, in 2005, one study found that only 5% of the Indian population held a bank or a post office account. Only 5% of the population in 2005. Well, enter the Indian Universal ID project. A fairly simple idea, and that is without paper documentation, the mechanism to authenticate Indian citizens was through biometrics. So through iris scans and fingerprints, the entire Indian population will ultimately be identified and be provided with identity authentication mechanisms so as to enable many services. The biometric ID is now being issued to all citizens. They are doing the work of scanning irises and fingerprints now. And with less than 2 years since the implementation of this program, the same study has estimated that today, 20% of Indians currently hold a bank or a post office account. So a 15% improvement over the course of about 7 years. To put that in context, that's 200 million citizens who have now been given access to the power of the information economy, to bank accounts, to social services, to many things so desperately needed there. The benefits of such a program are inescapable. The value of e-government in this context, the delivery of services through these electronic and digital means are inescapable. The lives of those Indians with those authentications are better through the use of this data. But when we then turn it to our world and think about the privacy and data protection challenges presented by a program like this, those challenges are staggering. Those problems likely make your head hurt. They are so big. There are many balances that we have to consider when we assess these issues. How do we look at the tension between the government as the provider of this authentication, this mechanism, and also the privacy protector, but also the source of the data? The government sits in many roles all at the same time. There is a balance of transparency, of access, of freedom of information with regards to privacy. In fact, there was a recent case in the United States that found that physical addresses, street and city, were properly disclosed under a Freedom of Information Act request, despite countervailing privacy arguments presented in the case. We need to balance these tensions in an e-government context every single day. There are other balances as well. There is a difficult issue of creating and enforcing use restrictions. Once a government gathers data, much like any entity, there are other valuable uses of that data. This also raises the issue of big data and the value of unexpected uses, unexpected values of data. How do we protect the ability for us to innovate in the future while recognizing the privacy concerns of today? In my opinion, it seems that governments must adopt the best of data management and data governance practices in order to respond to these concerns. We must expect continued evolution and maturity in our approach to managing data. Privacy professionals in both the public and the private sectors must find ways that allow the great benefits of the information economy, the great benefits of e-government to flow to citizens while respecting the complex matrix of norms, laws, regulations, and even individual expectations with regards to privacy. To state it more simply, the issue of privacy in e-government, in a manner exactly the same as privacy in the private sector, demands hard work. Yes, we need fundamental constructs of the rights to privacy, and yes, we need policy frameworks. These discussions we're having today are important, but the future of e-government is today, and we need individuals who can use the tools of the privacy profession, privacy impact assessments, data classification, data flow audits, vendor data management, risk assessment tools, risk mitigation tools, technologies like data loss prevention, transborder data flow mechanisms, the measures and metrics that you use to manage a program to ensure that you're doing it right. Yes, this is privacy by design, and yes, these are the hallmarks of an accountable data management program, but it's more than that too. It is the day-to-day focus required by individuals who are in organizations, in agencies, in governments, doing the hard work of privacy day by day. This requires enormous investments of time and resources. And so we come to one of the more difficult balances in this discussion over e-government. Now, this balance, this tension exists for both private and public sector, and certainly exists in e-government, but also exists in just about every offering in the marketplace today. And that is, how do we balance resource limitations that affect our ability to deliver better privacy against those demands for better, more sufficient privacy practices in e-gov and elsewhere? In other words, in an era in which all budgets are being reduced, how do we continue to manage privacy effectively when it is such a resource-intensive effort within organizations? Let me share a few numbers with you from the IAPP that Chris Wolf alluded to earlier. In January of 2009, the IAPP had 5,000 members around the world. Just 24 months later, in December 2010, the IAPP had 7,500 members around the world. We had 50% growth over a 24-month period. Now, these are privacy professionals. These are the people doing the work of privacy in public and private sector organizations around the world. Over 24 months, 50% growth is quite remarkable. I think most nonprofit organizations would look at that and be quite satisfied with that growth. When we consider that growth in the time period in which it occurred, which coincided with the worst economic crisis, certainly in the United States, since the Great Depression, that growth is simply phenomenal. It means in an era in which every other agency, sector, area of the market was reducing headcount, reducing employees, investments were being made in privacy. That tells me that this issue of privacy is so significant, is raising such risks, that organizations are being forced to invest, even with tough economic times. And since then, how have we grown? Well, we have nearly 12,000 members today. So our growth has continued at a phenomenal rate. These are the people doing the hard work of privacy. These are the people who bring privacy knowledge into conference rooms, much smaller than this, into product development meetings, into meetings with customers and constituents. They are the people who bring privacy into the DNA of an organization. When it comes to e-government, though, I'm somewhat saddened to say that our membership is not as strong. We have 1,400 governmental members within our broader membership. And I think it's reasonable to say that the public sector has not matched the pace of the private sector in adopting the hard work of privacy that will ultimately be needed as we roll out e-government. So in short, we must invest in the training, the knowledge, the education, the certifications for government professionals. We must do this in order to extract all of the benefits of e-government. We cannot wait for a framework or a law or a regulation because that work is happening today. Those programs are being initiated today, and we're already much too far behind. So, as moderator, I'm looking forward to a conversation with my fellow panelists of this complex world of limited government resources, of multiple roles for governments in this situation, of that of controller, of processor, and enforcer, all at the same time, and the unending march of technology and the need to meet citizens where they congregate. With that, let me turn things to Professor Pierre Trudel for his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Network environments, network environments change the condition in which information circulates. This change requires a rereading the fundamental principle of personal information protection law and some upgrades of the law of the pre-existent rule, even in data protection and in the governance of the governance environments. Both e-government framework and data protection must be upgraded. Let's take a look on how and what. E-government centered on the individual, e-government tries to take advantage of the potential of information technology to bring government closer to the people. In other words, to facilitate people contact and interaction with government bodies. Such bodies increasingly operate in a closely linked manner. Information circulates less and less in data banks located in specific spaces and more in network environments. This has consequences for the action that should be taken to ensure an effective balance between protection of privacy and the efficiency requirements of system for managing various public services. Increasingly, the exercise of government functions requires the ability to dialogue with all concerned. The advantage of putting government services and functions online is that it brings government closer to the governed. Inspired by paradigm inherited from internet environments, e-government applications seek to reach individuals and offer them services in a user-friendly way according to a client-centered approach that places the individual at the heart of the mission of governmental bodies. These conditions of increased information circulation also require that precautions be taken because the potential for accumulation and cross-referencing of information is much greater in computer networks than in exchange occurring elsewhere. This requires a realistic attitude that takes into account both the advantage and the disadvantages of the circulation of the information. Privacy is not an outmoded value, but red tape is. More and more people expect to find public services offered in the context and under the condition that information technologies might make now possible. Many advanced like companies that use Web 2.0 applications to remain in constant contact with their clients and partners, government in coming years will be based largely on changes it will undergo on the stakes involved in the Internet 2.0, namely connectivity, intense connectivity, new relationship with people, new partnership, new responsibilities, transparency, dialogue, and service customization requirements. Of course, the basic principle, the basic privacy protection principles should be reread in that fashion. It's become, of course, it's became, since the years it's now implemented, part of what we call fair information practices, but it should be reread in order to reflect the new characteristic of networks environment. Because of uncertainty, we rely on principles in these very high velocity change questions, but these principles remains the basic ones on which the upgrading must take place. The fundamental principle of data protection flow, of course, from a very large consensus, and it is a solid basis, and they provide a solid basis to enhance and to upgrade the protection in the e-government environment. And for this upgrading, I suggest you some additional principles. It's not necessarily different principles, but more precise principles about on what fashion e-governance should be developed in order to be in phase with the privacy principle. First of all, the right to privacy-friendly technology. Effective privacy protections requires development of a right to the establishment of technological environment for e-government that increase and decrease privacy protection. Public decision makers and private enterprise may find themselves required to demonstrate that the technology they use meets minimum standard, at least according to privacy. One of these minimum standards should be for the citizen, the guarantee of an effective control of access. In a network world, effective protection of personal data cannot rely on measures that immobilize information. In an e-government situation, people are not free, of course, to decide who will access their personal information, but they are entitled to know that only those who are legally authorized to access will access to their information. What must be done in accordance with that is a guarantee, a solid guarantee, that only those with the right to do so are able to access the personal data. The legal framework has to intervene at the level of the obligation to configure personal information processing system in a way that guarantee that only those who are entitled access effectively to the information. Other part of this upgrading that it seems to be needed is concerning responsibility. Every entity likely to access personal data in a network can be considered as the legal holder of the data. As such, the entity is responsible for the confidentiality, and so it is important to specify the obligation and delimit the responsibility of managers with respect to confidentiality and security requirements. Indeed, they have to be clearly stated standards in light of which the behavior and responsibility of individuals as well as managers will be evaluated. Network environment empower individuals, citizens, and public officers. The framework should reflect that. And one way that must be pursued in order to reflect this new kind of situation is the principle of end-to-end accountability. In a government organization, thus composed of networks, the issue that law has to deal with is regulation of rights and duties relating to episode of the life cycle of a piece of information. While in paper-dominated bureaucratic law focuses on delimiting the right to obtain a given piece of information, in a networked world, law tends toward the establishment of a means of regulating access and use authorization devolved to decision makers and individuals. Each should be accountable in accordance with their role regarding personal data. The quality requirement. In a world where information circulates more and more, the challenge is to ensure that data will be of a quality appropriate for each of its use. Quality is a component of the relation of trust that necessarily has to exist between users and government. If users, citizens are not certain that everything is being done to ensure that decisions are made using information of the highest possible quality, they will have no trust. Effort thus has to be focused on seeking efficient regulation of personal data rather than on trying to expand the range of application of legislation, even with respect to public data. In most situations, information quality is assessed in relation of the context. A piece of information may be appropriate for one purpose, but completely insufficient or even inappropriate for another. In the context of interaction in networks, it becomes easier to evaluate, often with the person concerned herself, whether information meets the quality requirements for a decision to be made. Online, connected citizens can validate in real time personal information that an administration intends to use. This is an example of the new ways by which it becomes possible to guarantee the quality of information used in the decision-making process. And finally, effective sanction. Even in e-government, if serious recourse were available to people and if were applied effectively, it would become possible to make it more risky and less profitable to engage in practices that violate privacy. In conclusion, the spread of network spaces to support the delivery of public services requires the mobilization of a set of norms so as to provide an effective, efficient guarantee of protection of personal information. In the networked world, normativity takes concrete form in a set of technological, administrative, and legal vectors. And in this environment, personal information protection regulations have to be designed and enforced in a way that makes optimal use of technology's potential so as to increase protection. Legal normativity has to ensure that technological configurations, which by default can both increase risk and also protect privacy, are in compliance with the principles of personal information protection. This is difficult to reconcile with a hierarchical, authoritarian, bureaucratic vision of personal information protection. Thus, we can see the dimension of this challenge of establishing regulatory strategies that will ensure effective, rather than purely formal, protection of privacy for people who interact with government. And that's my conclusion, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias, Professor Trudeau. That was very interesting, and your call for legal normativity with regards to e-government, I think, will be a topic of conversation very soon. I'd like to turn now to Mr. Wagner Diniz, who is the manager of the W3C in Brazil.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. It's hard to decide in which language to speak because my English is not good enough to give a talk on the matter. I'm not expert. And I don't speak Spanish. I speak Portuguese. For many, Portuguese is a badly spoken Spanish. So, considering that the lunchtime is knocking the door, I have to switch, and I will prefer to speak in a mixture of in Spanish and Portuguese for the sake of the translators. So please switch and put your headset on, please. I'll try to make my best to speak faster, okay? Minha apresentação está com particular foco em dados abiertos, porque creo que datos abiertos es algo muy importante en el contexto de la privacidad de la información. Yo trabajo en el Comité Gestor de la Internet en Brasil, que W3C es una oficina de W3C internacional y W3C global, es una área del Comité Gestor de la Internet en Brasil. La regulación brasileira no tiene hoy día una ley específica para la protección de datos personales. Todavía, desde la Constitución que está vigorando en Brasil, hay distintas regulaciones, diferentes regulaciones y algunas leyes que tratan en algunos aspectos de la protección de datos abiertos, como el Instituto de Habeas Data, como o Código de Defesa de Protección del Consumidor, que donde se encuentran derechos acerca de los datos personales de registro para hacer las transacciones comerciales. Há também muito interessante que é a lei de responsabilidade fiscal, que é uma lei que impacta todos os governos locais de los estados e incluso o governo federal acerca da necessidade de transparência em los datos de governo. Muito recentemente, há a lei de acesso à informação, e eu tenho particular interesse nesta lei e vou falar pouco sobre ela. A lei de acesso à informação é muito recente, como podemos ver nesta apresentação. É uma lei que passou no Congresso e a Presidente da República aprovou a lei, sancionou e está vigorando desde maio deste ano. Portanto, é muito nova lei. Pero lo que é interessante nesta lei é que lo que tinha como uma possibilidade para o cidadão, ou seja, a possibilidade de aceder às informações governamentais, agora é direito. E é direito que está estabelecido em lei muito claramente. Não há como o governo dizer não lhe dou a informação que me pide. E há prazo que está estabelecido na lei e que diz que o governo tem em no mais 20 dias para contestar, para responder as demandas por informações. Muito bem, é direito. E depois de 4 meses, este é o último reporte acerca da efetividade desta lei. Temos quase 40.000 solicitações, demanda de informação, com 92% de contestação positiva. É verdade que há que, todavia, evaluar a qualidade destas respostas positivas, pero é muito importante que tenhamos 92% de contestação positiva e solamente pouco mais de 8% de respostas negativas, com tempo médio de respostas de 10 dias. Muito bem. Se vamos a mirar por que temos resposta negativa, há que ter em conta que a resposta negativa, em sua maioria, é porque se trata de demandas de solicitações de personal data ou, então, de documentos que se consideram secretos. Bueno, é uma quantidade muito pequena de informações que não se tem resposta do governo. Assim, nos parece que a lei de acesso à informação em Brasil está indo muito bem. Há muitas coisas para se trabalhar, é verdade, mas está indo muito bem e a gente está muito involucrada e cada vez mais demanda por informações do governo. Há ponto muito particular em esta lei que me chama a atenção e gostaria que você pudesse comigo trabalhar pouco isto, entender e tentar ver o que temos que fazer ou temos que ter em conta para tratar da privacidade da informação. A lei de acesso à informação em Brasil é a primeira lei no mundo que tem artículo muito explícito, muito claro, que diz que o governo tem que abrir as informações de público interesse. Não? Não. Uma outra parte deste artículo diz que é mandatório, é obrigatório, é requerido do governo que estas informações estejam disponíveis no sítio da internet. Bueno, adelante, se dice, no basta estar en la Internet. Tiene que hacer más. Las informaciones gubernamentales tienen que estar en la Internet, pero en lo punto 2, tiene que estar disponible para download. Yo tengo que tener la habilidad de bajar las informaciones para mi computadora. Outro ponto muito importante, não basta bajar, ter a capacidade ou a habilidade de bajar em meu computador. É muito importante e é mandatório, requerido que as informações sejam acessíveis em formato aberto por sistemas externos. E, finalmente, que haya detalhe acerca destas informações. Bueno, tradução de tudo isto. Se acá tenho minha computadora, minha ordenadora, e estou em sítio de governo, tem que ter capacidade de fazer download, por exemplo, de documento .doc ou de uma spreadsheet .xls. Esta é a primeira coisa. Não há que ter dificuldade, impedimento para fazer isto. Outra coisa, mais do que isto, tempo, me alarme. Outra coisa importante, não basta que barre minha computadora, ordenadora, pero tenho que, com meus sistemas, poder comunicar com o sistema que tornam disponíveis essas informações. Há que ter capacidade de intercambiar informações. Isto se trata de fazer interoperabilidade, dados abertos. E mais, há que ter informações acerca dos dados, para que eu pueda fazer a interoperabilidade. Assim diz a lei. Nadie a compreende até agora. Pero estamos movendo adelante e as coisas estão melhorando. Mas assim é. E este é ponto que eu quero que tu compreendas muito bem, porque, por exemplo, dados abertos é tão importante que tem exemplo aqui. Por exemplo, isto está disponível para sua computadora, seu smartphone. Isto se não tem combustível, se está em tu automóvel, coche e não tem combustível, está buscando uma estação de combustível mais cerca. Assim, aí está. E na segunda pantalla, tu pode escolher qual é o teu combustível e qual é a tua estação mais preferida, e aí está. E na terceira pantalla que tu tens, é mapa para como chegar lá. Isto é possível porque em distintas páginas web, mais de 10 páginas distintas do órgão de governo que hace a regulação de la energia e combustível em Brasil, eu tenho essas informações, pero tipo da sociedade civil trabalhou todas essas informações em uma aplicação de interesse da sociedade civil. Esta outra aplicação muito interessante se trata do mapa da violência no estado do Rio Grande do Sul. A Secretaria de Seguridade Pública nesse estado há disponível as informações e os dados da violência no estado. Uma outra organização da sociedade civil trabalhou essas informações e agora tem por colores onde há mais ou menos violência no estado do Rio Grande do Sul e se pode incluso trabalhar por distintos tipos de violência se tu queres fazer trabalho de controle social. Por lo tanto, dados abertos se trata de conectividade, disponibilidade da informação em la internet, se trata de formatos abertos e se trata de reutilização da informação para obtener nuevos significados. Esto se trata de una plataforma muy nueva para gobierno electrónico, donde el gobierno electrónico del pasado, el gobierno era el centro del gobierno electrónico. Ahora, con los datos abiertos, el ciudadano es el centro, es una mudanza en el eje del gobierno electrónico para que los ciudadanos puedan desarrollar aplicaciones de acuerdo con su interés, de acuerdo con su perspectiva, de acuerdo con su timing. No traigo respuesta acerca de datos abiertos y privacidad. Lo que traigo es un problema a más, porque esto es nuevo en gobierno electrónico, hay mucha gente trabajando con esto ahora y hay una área a más que tenemos que nos preocupar. Yo planteo un nuevo desafío y que lo propongo es que todos nosotros estemos disponibles para trabajar la cadena de valor de datos abiertos. Hay muchos actores que están involucrados en datos abiertos y la mayoría no lo saben. Un ejemplo, para datos abiertos, hasta ahora no hay un debate sobre licencia de datos abiertos. Hay derechos autorales para textos, hay licencia para software, aplicaciones, pero no hay licencia sobre los datos que yo estoy tornando disponible. Hay que involucrar los abogados, hay que involucrar la gente del sector público para hacer un debate acerca da licencia. Hay otros actores que tenemos que involucrar, que son la gente de tecnología, la gente de la sociedad civil, para que se pueda desarrollar aplicaciones que sean más fáciles de acceder por la población y con seguridad y con la certeza de que los datos están protegidos, los datos personales. Y más, hay que hacer un debate más profundo acerca del interés mayor de la sociedad, interés público general y los datos privados. Lo que es muy bueno en la Ley de Acceso a Información en Brasil es que el acceso a información es la regla, el secreto es excepción. Y como ha dito un importante escritor brasileño que estudió la formación del Estado moderno en Brasil, cuando salimos del colonialismo para el Estado moderno, lo que pasó en Brasil y todavía sigue mejorando, hay un triunfo del interés general sobre el interés particular. Y este debate de privacidad está muy cerca del debate acerca del interés público general. Yo no tengo respuesta. Y además sigo preguntando si es posible encontrar un equilibrio entre los intereses particulares, privados y los intereses públicos generales. Es un debate muy grande que tenemos que hacer. Muchas gracias.
Muito obrigado, senhor Diniz. Eu também falo portunhol, então foi muito claro para mim. In the two presentations we've had, we have a great representation of both a call for legal normativity, an upgrade in our legal frameworks to think about e-government in a new context, and for standards, new standards perhaps, that need to be applied as we adopt these powerful tools to improve the lives of citizens. And we see an example of the government of Brazil, without a broad-based privacy law, implementing perhaps the best of the world in terms of transparency of government practices, access to open data, and in fact opening up the idea of e-government not to just government employees providing services, but actual citizens providing mashups and applications and new uses of data that may have been completely unintended or unexpected when that data was originally collected or gathered. We now have the opportunity to engage a conversation. I believe we have 10 minutes or so, and so I would like to start with this idea of balance. And for both Wagner and Pierre, I'd like to ask the question about balance. We had, at the end of Wagner's presentation, a very clear question. How do we balance these interests of transparency, which go by many names around the world? Access, transparency, freedom of information. How do we balance those interests against the countervailing interests of privacy? Where is the point? And can we find global balances that are interoperable, or will these balances be based on cultural considerations country by country? Who would like to start? Pierre.
Of course, to a large extent it reflects values that might be different in various societies. I think living in Canada, we every day see the differences of value in the U.S. and in Canada in the determination of what should be protected in the name of privacy and what should be circulating in the name of transparency. So it's primarily, I would say, cultural. But maybe in one world, in a planetary dimension in which we are now, we should try to work around the concept of human dignity. So there is, I would argue, that some aspect of the person, of the human person, which is closely related to dignity. And that should be, in my sense, the hard rock of the privacy, I would say. And it might be universal. It might be viewed as a universal value. But beside that, we have to accept that there is some cultural differences in order to define this frontier between transparency and privacy.
Excellent. And before we turn to Wagner, we do have microphones in the audience, and we would like to open up for questions right after this. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and the microphone will get to you. Wagner.
Okay, I'm not sure we can come to a real balance between privacy and open data or transparency. But let me tell you what we are doing in Brazil within the W3C. We create, or we form, a group. We call it a local committee on open data. And now we have more than 40 people getting together every 2 or 3 months in order to define a public agenda for opening up data. So we have government, we have civil society present, law people from the press, and also non-profit organization. And there are a lot of demand for open data in the government. And what you say is, as a society, we want those data. And the government say, look, those data I can't give you, but this and this and this I can give you. So they are sitting together, they are talking to each other, and they are defining what kind of data they will open up, and also according to some limitations of privacy, they say, because of that, we cannot open up this data. So if we sit together and we can establish some kind of agreement, I think that we can give some steps ahead in this area of coming to a possible convergence between transparency and privacy.
Very good. I think we have a question.
Yes. I'm going to make my question in Spanish. So, I think that the issue of open government is a challenge for organizations in terms of data protection and in terms of information, and considering that there are some authority models that have both roles, I would like to know when we decide to open a public database, should we have a process and have standards of public interest for that? Because who decides what is public interest? And when one specific person could be affected. In Mexico, we have the MINUSAL, the organization that has both roles. We carry out this public tests, but in other countries, like for example Canada, is there any previous consultation to the general public before that that includes the civil society?
So a wonderful question. I had spoken about the balance between governments in many roles of data controller and processor and enforcer all at the same time. Sometimes the regulator in a country also sits in both the enforcer of privacy law role, but also as the provider of freedom of information, of transparency into that government. So Lena has rightly raised an important issue. Gentlemen, the question then of public access to that process, public contribution to that process, is it important? Is it significant? How should that be done? Please.
I would suggest that one of the most efficient way to deal with this very, very difficult question, of course, is to determine whether public interest or privacy must prevail, is using at least the most possible transparent process in order to put together various stakeholders in order to establish a dialogue between what should be transparent, what should be public, and what should be protected. And it may help to generate consensus, because I would suggest you that it's very hard to implement or to apply a law making more public or more private data from government data banks if there is no consensus, no social consensus. And in many cases, I would suggest that on the long term, the public dialogue, the transparent discussion of all the issues might be the most efficient way to get an answer, or to, at least to get always temporary answer to that, because public interest is a very movable, very mobile concept. It might change depending on the technological environment or the social ecology, and this can change very fast. So an ongoing regulatory process open to all the kind of value and point of view in a specific society might be the most efficient way to deal with these very difficult questions.
Em portunhol, a mim me preocupa muitíssimo quando governos empiezam a abrir seus dados sem ter diálogo com a sociedade. Bueno, en Brasil, creo que en Latinoamérica también, hay una escasez de recursos públicos y no hay que hacer malo uso de los recursos. Entonces, si abrimos los datos y los datos no son de interés de la sociedad, no estamos usando los recursos públicos de la manera más eficiente. Por isso que o W3C em Brasil, por exemplo, intentamos fazer cada vez mais diálogo entre as partes para que isto seja mais efetivo e que se pueda atender a demanda da sociedade. Incluso agora começamos a formar comitês regionais mais cerca da comunidade local de dados abertos, porque assim entendemos que é mais eficiente e mais responsável com os recursos públicos.
I think we have time for one last question.
¿Qué tal? Buenos días. Iván Salgado, de Datos Públicos de Ecuador. Un poco me parece que mi compañera ya había abarcado y los expositores parte de la respuesta que les pido. En Ecuador, desde el 2004 existe una ley de acceso a la información pública, transparencia a la información pública, y desde 2010 existe ya una ley de Sistema Nacional de Registro de Datos Públicos donde se habla de los datos. Un poco el conflicto sería, de lo que hemos estado hablando desde ayer, ¿dónde pone el gobierno o dónde pone el Estado esta línea tan delgada que parece ser entre la acumulación de datos que tiene el Estado y que yo como ciudadano sienta que el Estado tiene demasiada información mía y está yendo contra mi privacidad? Es decir, ¿cómo yo como ciudadano logro tener una aceptación para con el Estado que tenga un montón de información mía para darme servicios y no para vigilarme? ¿Y cómo logro yo por Estado determinar que me proveo de esa información para obtener un mejor resultado para el Estado y no para hacer un análisis más allá de eso?
And again, the tension between e-government and the collection of data and the use of data is raised. Gentlemen, how do we answer this problem? What is the answer? I'll share my answer, and that is that I don't think there is a single answer. I actually think it is found in the hard work of managing data day by day. And again, I don't think that's found in policy frameworks. I think that is found office by office, meeting by meeting, database by database, where we put controls and manage data effectively. That requires people who know how to manage data. So one of the things that we have not talked a lot about in the debate over privacy around the world is the need for people with knowledge about how to manage data. They are the people who make decisions day to day in the conference rooms, in the offices, in the meetings, where it is important, where the risks are created. So training employees, government professionals on the value of data, how it needs to be used, how it can't be used, how to protect it appropriately. Those are some of the tools that will move us towards an answer, because I don't think we will ever come to a day when we say we're done and we should be satisfied with our work. Gentlemen, anything you'd like to add? Okay. On that note, please join me in thanking our panelists today. And I do believe we are now adjourned for lunch. Thank you.